Hello, today I'm going to prepare some sourdough breadsticks. In this jar is my current sourdough culture. Now I've made all sorts of different sourdough cultures. This one I'm particularly fond of. It performs very well. You never know quite what you're going to get because it depends on which particular strains of wild yeasts and bacteria colonise the culture. All this is a mixture of flour and water, and that's allowed to ferment with the wild yeasts that are present in the flour, and from this you can make wonderful tasting bread. It's slower to work than a baker's yeast, but it brings with it a great deal of flavour. Now, keeping a sourdough culture is much like having a pet. It needs regular feeding and watering. Now when I'm not making sourdough bread, this lives in the fridge and it can stay there quite happily for a week or two without feeding. Then I have to take it out, feed it once or twice, and then it can go back in the fridge. Now this is about to get its final feed before I pop it back in the fridge. As I'm not planning to make sourdough bread today, the amount of culture I remove from here, rather than just throw it away, I'm going to make some breadsticks from it. So, first to refresh the culture, I keep 400 grams of culture here, and you can keep that at various hydrations, but I keep this at 100%, so there's 200 grams of flour and 200 grams of water in this. So I'm just going to remove 200 grams, so that's half of the culture. Okay. Zero the scales. I'm going to add 100 grams of flour, and 100 grams of water. I'll give that a quick mix. And that's now ready to pop back in the fridge, and it's going to be quite happy there for a couple of weeks. If I need to make sourdough bread in the meantime, I'll just take that out a day or two beforehand, let it warm up, then give it a quick feed before I use it. So now to prepare the breadsticks. So I've got 200 grams of the culture in here. I'm going to add another 100 grams of flour to that. And about 20 grams of water. Four grams of salt. And 20 grams of olive oil. Okay. Just going to give that a quick mix. just going to leave that for about 20 minutes before I come and knead it. Now it's only a very small amount of dough. This isn't for any particularly good reason except to use a little bit of that discarded culture. It's also stiffer than I would make for a bread dough, but that's exactly what we want for the breadsticks. So I'll be back in 20 minutes or so. So the dough's had about 20 minutes or so now for the flour to absorb the water, and then give this a quick knead. Now, I normally knead bread dough which is quite wet on a surface which has no oil or flour or anything else, but for these little breadsticks I'm going to put some flour on the worktop. I do not need a particularly wet dough for this. So I'm quite happy if some of this flour is absorbed by the dough until it becomes fairly dry. So I'm just going to stretch that out and work the dough. I'll add more flour to the worktop as needed. Okay. Now I've given that a couple of minutes of kneading, and it's nowhere near developed like you would want to develop a bread dough, but there's some elasticity in it, and that's perfectly adequate for a breadstick. So I'll just flour the bowl, form that dough up, and pop it in the bowl. I'm going to have to leave this for at least a couple of hours, maybe longer. It all depends on how active the sourdough culture happens to be. But this will need several hours now to rise. I'm not going to fold it like I would a normal bread dough. I'm just going to come back and shape some breadsticks. So my dough has now had 2.5, maybe 3 hours to ferment, and it's doubled in size. It's ready to be turned into breadsticks. I've got some semolina here which I'm just going to sprinkle on this baking sheet, stop them sticking. Also going to use some of this on the worktop. Nice. So I could roll these breadsticks and try and get them as uniform as possible, but I'd rather prefer a rustic looking breadstick. So I'm just going to stretch these out by hand. Just going to cut off a portion of dough, and if I pull this from each end, it's likely to just thin in the middle and that part will burn. So all I'm going to do is just run that through my fingers and just stretch those out by hand. You can make these as thick as you like, you can make them as long as you like. Okay, so there's a couple of trays of breadsticks of various lengths, and they're a little bit rustic looking, but they're going to bake up lovely. Now, if you wanted to, you could brush those with olive oil and then maybe sprinkle on some sesame seed or poppy seed. I rather like them just as they are. So I'm going to pop the oven on now to 220 degrees, and I'll leave those to rise for about half an hour, and then I'm going to pop them in the oven. So here are the finished breadsticks. I've baked these for about 15 minutes at 220 degrees. You need to adjust that baking time depending how thick the breadsticks are. We're looking for a nice golden colour, but we don't want them burnt. Now they're a little rustic, but they are quite delicious. There's a good snap. It's got great sourdough flavour. You can just taste a little of the olive oil in there. This is so much better than something one might remove from a plastic wrapped package. This is a really good breadstick. And much better than throwing the sourdough culture away. Enjoy. I certainly am.